let me share the spotlight just for a moment so I can introduce you, and then I will be out of your face. Let me let everybody in here, turn off that stupid sound. There we go. Disable the waiting room and admit everyone. All right, we are streaming live on the YouTubes. I want all of you tonight. Oh, one more step. Ooh, ooh, a little greasy. Hello, everyone. We'll give everybody a couple seconds just to get in and get comfortable. Settle in, settle down. There we go. That looks better. Let's highlight every blemish. All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. We are going to get started with our next live presentation, and I am super excited to have my friend and colleague and now student, which I feel like almost nervous even saying, almost Dr. Ines Kalita. Almost, so close. We're almost there in the last stretch. Ines Kalita is a passionate advocate for health, equity, and justice, and with a real focus on Black birthing communities. Like I said, she's almost doctorate. She's a doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins, and she has a master's in public health. Really, her work centers dismantling anti-Black racism in healthcare. Now, that's loaded. We have all of these places where we see that at, but she's addressing obstetric violence and promoting trauma-responsive care. So her bio is much longer and goes on and on. You can read more about her on the ConsentCon website, but I wanted to introduce her. This topic is very important because a lot of us really don't have tools and strategies that we need to advocate for ourselves in medical spaces. And for those of us that have experienced any trauma at all, it becomes even harder. So hopefully this helps you in your way or in a way for you to support someone else, whether that's a client, a friend, a lover, or a stranger, shit, because everybody who needs this. I'm gonna go ahead and get my face off the screen and let Ines have the whole spotlight. Thank you, Ines. Welcome.
Hey, thank you, Amina. Oh, I'm so excited to be here. And look, people are here. It's not empty. I'm glad that you all found this session important and that you wanted to join. And it is my hope that you are able to take away something from this session that benefits yourself, your loved ones, clients, folks you're advocating for, friends, lovers, so on and so forth. I am going to pull my slides up here. I know that a lot of people during ConsentCon have not used slides, but I am an old nerd and I need to have my slides or I'll be up here talking to y'all all day. Just want to make sure that everybody can see the slides. If I can get a thumbs up, a virtual thumbs up or a yeah. All right. Thank you, Natalia. I appreciate that. All right. So today we're going to be talking about, as Amina mentioned, medical consent strategies for survivors of sexual harm. Now, this slide looks a little bit different from the description because my presentation typically is going to focus on survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Now, there are going to be things in here that I think will be relevant for folks who are survivors of general sexual harm. But I want to make sure that that's really clear, that there's a particular additional context when it comes to survivors of childhood sexual abuse that we have to pay attention to. So as we jump into that, like we've said, I think in a lot of these sessions before, make sure that you are taking care of yourselves. There's material in here that may be particularly sensitive to some of you. And I would just encourage you to check in with your bodies, practice your own breathing and grounding techniques, step away if you need to, and come back to the session when you're able to engage fully. All right, so let's get started on this ride. So here's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, some of the topics we're going to explore. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk in depth about the Black maternal health climate, What does it look like accessing services for sexual and reproductive health? What do those spaces look like? What are the pieces surrounding those climates that we have to navigate on a daily or a regular basis? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we understand trauma's impact on the provision of those care services, as well as how trauma impacts our ability to give and withhold consent. A part of that conversation will focus on how we respond to shame in these scenarios and how we respond to perceived lack of autonomy in these medical spaces. And then lastly, my hope is to leave you with some tools and resources that help each of you, as well as those in your inner circles, your ITP and OTP, navigate authentic engagement with medical providers, your ability to practice better self-advocacy, as well as building consent confidence and activating support that you can have in your corner. All right. So I cannot really check the time. So I'm just going to keep flowing. If folks have questions or if you need to raise your hand, I can see that. I can see hand raising, but I'm not able to see the chat. All right. So in terms of positionality, this is just my statement, how I come to this work. And y'all will notice, I think, in some of these slides that some of them have more of a kind of academic or research tinge to them. And I'll try to kind of strip that down as much as possible. I am typically in scenarios where I'm presenting to clinicians, to providers, to doulas, to midwives, so on and so forth. So some of that may have a little bit of that tinge to it. So in terms of my positionality, I am both a Black mother and a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, both of which I believe impacted the quality of care that I received and accessing services in the maternal health care system. As a Black woman, just in general, I have experienced diminished quality of care that did not recognize the pervasiveness of sexual abuse, sexual trauma, and violence among Black pregnant people, women, femmes, gender expansive people. And so because of my own personal experiences, I am very, very sensitive to issues of intersectionality, where the issues of race, gender, stereotypes, and misperceptions, where they cloud our medical spaces. Also particularly sensitive to issues of sexual abuse and the heightened potential to inflame trauma during maternal health care. There are a lot of theories that inform my work. Some are listed here, primarily Black feminist, womanist theoretical approaches, reproductive justice, critical race theory, human rights, so on and so forth, all of which really, when we get down to the center of them, says that we have a core set of rights. We have a right to own our bodies. We have a right to be in possession of our bodies and to advocate for the care and quality of care that we need to live healthy and vibrant lives. And that's kind of the intersection between all of those. And lastly, I believe in returning to an ethic of embodiment as a central tool to better support authentic consent practices and non-linear healing. So that's the way I'm kind of showing up in this space. These are the things that I'll throw together and put at the table. One thing that's not listed here is that I'm a public health practitioner, so a lot of my research and a lot of my own lived experiences goes into trying to create programs, responsive programs for people who have been affected by similar histories and people who are looking for healing inside of traditional and non-traditional maternal health and reproductive health spaces. All right. So the maternal health climate in the US and globally. So I know that, I talk about this all day and all night, so I'll try not to bore you too much. But I think that what's happened recently is that there's been a lot of conversation over the last 5 years or so about the Black maternal health crisis. What does it look like right now for Black birthing people, Black pregnant people trying to access care, trying to have access to abortion care, just trying to access sexual and reproductive health in general. And a lot of what we hear is very negative. We know that Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely to die from childbirth related causes in the year following childbirth, during labor, and in the year following childbirth. We also know that Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience something that we call severe maternal morbidity, which is the prolonged illnesses and sequelae that happen. So let's say you didn't die giving birth, but you've got these long-term issues that you're dealing with as a consequence of something unforeseen that happened, some particular traumatic instance that happened during your birth or labor process. So overall, I would say Black women in the US are in a bit of a precarious state. The data has been holding fairly consistent over the last few years. We've got more spotlights on it, more eyes on the data. And when we peel back that data, what we see is that there is nothing, as you all know, inherently wrong with Black bodies, nothing wrong with Black women, Black femme, Black gender expansive bodies. But what we have is the experience of racism and oppression inside of healthcare spaces that make Black people's concerns suppress, that make Black people's ideas and opinions on Black people's bodies be overtaken by medical providers, and in general, just suppression of voice and choice and lack of dignity inside of these care spaces that lead to these poor outcomes for Black birthing people. And this is not just in the US, we're also seeing this outside of the US in global context, where Black bodies are often acted upon, right? And where we find ourselves struggling with some degree of autonomy inside of medical spaces, bumping up against what does the medical power system look like. So that's kind of the context, right? So we just know that just going in general in these spaces, that there are ideas, there are thoughts and approaches to our bodies that are not informed by ourselves, that are not informed by our own kind of embodied lived experience, that are formed by the paternalistic white male dominated and white female dominated healthcare system, right? So we already know that we're going in and challenging some pretty vicious power structures. So now if we take that and put on top of that the idea that there are additional levels of marginalization, there are additional levels of individuals who need more space to be able to advocate for themselves, such as the group that we're going to talk about today. 40 to 60% of Black women report experiencing sexual abuse or assault before age 18. So the 40% is kind of national survey level data. 60% is what's reported when Black women do surveys with other Black women. So I tend to lean on the 60% side. So we think about that, that is 6 out of 10 Black women who have identified reporting the experience of sexual abuse, either direct or non-direct sexual abuse before age 18. Now, this is particularly interesting because and which makes this a little bit different from other types of sexual trauma, is that a lot of the childhood sexual abuse goes into a phase of repression, and that most folks are not aware. They may have suppressed the memories of childhood sexual abuse so much that they're not even necessarily recognizing these experiences as something that has happened to them. However, childhood sexual abuse and the ramifications of it often emerge during the childbearing years. During the periods where individuals are accessing more sexual and reproductive health care, we see these memories and this remembering, as we call it, like the evolution of remembering occurring when we're accessing these services. And childhood sexual abuse has a particular ramification for long-term adult mental health and likelihood of developing PTSD and other mental health sequelae, other maternal mental health outcomes as well. So Amina has said, and I think just about most of the presenters this week during Consent Con have talked about why trauma is important. So this is just kind of a general approach, and we'll talk a little bit more about this and childhood sexual abuse in particular. But we know that trauma is impacting every area of human functioning: our physical, our mental, our behavioral, social, sexual, spiritual aspects of ourselves. This trauma is touching every particular place that it can touch. In the case of birthing people, we know that this trauma can lead birthing people to feel powerless, to feel more on guard in their interactions with maternal care providers. So if we take the context of maternal health settings and we add another layer that says now people who have this particular childhood sexual trauma are feeling even more powerless, right? In addition of going against the medical system, they're even more on guard in their interactions with maternal care providers. You can imagine the tension that goes into these interactions. And beyond that, the perinatal period in general, this is a period kind of pre pregnancy to postpartum is full of all kinds of triggers that might unexpectedly reveal or bring up past histories of traumas that people had not really recognized in themselves, or they have the potential to manifest new traumas in birthing people. We might want pregnancy or labor to be a mental experience, but in fact, pregnancy and labor are physiological embodied experiences. There are things and processes that are happening within our bodies, right? And if our bodies are storing and holding trauma, and the pregnancies and labors are also acting in those same areas, we know that we're going to be dealing with a complex scenario when it comes to finding the best type of healthcare and getting the best outcomes for birthing people who have this particular history. Something I think I mentioned a little bit before, there's also just social rhetoric and narrative around Black women's bodies, Black femme bodies that are woven into our perceptions of care. How do Black people show up when they're receiving care? Is the idea that Black women, femmes, gender expansive people are naturally combative, naturally aggressive, that their bodies can withstand more, that they're what they call like a gynecological hardiness, which is an insane term that really relates to these, racist and stereotypical ideas about what the Black female body can take and can be subjected to. So if we got all these things happening at the same time, right, from the perspective of medical professionals, and also understanding all the ways that Black people with these particular histories might not be able to show up fully, we've got a bit of a mess that we've got to sort out if we want to make sure that people are able to have the birthing experiences and the care that they desire. So in terms of the impact of trauma on the life course, not just the birthing scenario, but what does it look like? What does trauma look like long-term? We know that compounded trauma has long-term significance in our lives, that, having one traumatic event, we may be able to respond to. Having a multitude of traumatic events, having re-traumatization is definitely going to have a long-term significance on the way that we navigate, the way that we show up in this world in different settings. But we also know that there are particular types of trauma and histories of victimizations that impact pregnant and birthing people greatly, right? This idea of surrender, perhaps in the birthing process, surrender in the laboring process, and having a particular type of trauma may impact your ability to do that. We also know that sexual violence related trauma can impact breastfeeding initiation. If we want to talk about what happens within the family dynamic, what happens with infant bonding, what happens with just general adjustment periods. We know that it can interrupt breastfeeding initiation. It can interrupt the duration of breastfeeding and also cause extreme discomfort with certain physical aspects of childbirth and labor. And unless we're addressing these things, the potential for re-traumatization in these high intensity, high urgency scenarios is very high. Something that folks have been talking about this week as well is this idea of this kind of somatic detachment and this disassociation that we're experiencing. We know that if this trauma is not resolved, if this trauma is not addressed, there's a high likelihood for this disassociation and detaching from our bodies, which we really need to be present in during the birth, labor, and care processes. And lastly, as you would expect, there's an impact on the ability of us to give true consent, right? If you're in a scenario where everything is heightened, if the impact of the trauma is weighing on you currently in the scenario, how you show up authentically to be able to give consent is going to be compromised. And that's what we're hoping to address today. And hopefully with some of the other tools that you all have been picking up throughout the week, those things will be coming closer to the forefront as we take away some key lessons from this week. So thinking about what gets awakened in our, during the perinatal care process. So as I mentioned before, there may be some repression of childhood sexual abuse and the knowledge of that, right? That's, they find that, I think the research says that like 50% of childhood sexual abuse memories are repressed, right? And those things don't come out until individuals are adults, that they are later along in their life journeys and able to really address and to look at what healing looks like. So we know that there will be layered effects that are happening during the physiological birth process, which may be different from a more recent sexual assault or something that may have occurred as an adult that we know may be closer to the forefront. Having a surprising bodily memory of childhood sexual abuse may take the person off guard, may really catch them off guard. They're not anticipating the intensity of certain reactions that happen during the perinatal care process. So I think it's important to talk about why this sexual trauma like really impacts this birthing process. One, if we have a sexual trauma that occurs in our bodies, these are the same areas that we need to use, these areas, same areas that we need to be in touch with to actually be able to surrender during the birthing process. So it's not that there's something that happened to your arm, to your elbow. These are in the exact same places. So if this flood of adrenaline, it's happening in a very similar way, there can be a compounded impact on labor, which can cause labor to stall, to stop completely, right? If we think about what I mentioned on those early slides about maternal mortality and maternal morbidity, we know that there is a pressure, there is a rush on Black birthing people, on Black bodies to hurry up in labor, to get finished, to get through this process, get over the hump. And if we think about this flood of adrenaline that is surging from a trauma memory, stalling out labor, the idea that an unwanted, unrequested C-section may come up as an option now is a very real consequence. Is another aspect. So that's just really thinking about where trauma has happened inside of our bodies and where we need our bodies to surrender. Next, if a birthing person is asked to get into a position that is a reminder of their trauma, that's also going to have some similar effects, right? If labor is stalling out because they've been asked to be put in a position that they're uncomfortable with and they haven't been able to consent to being in that position, we're definitely going to see labor stalling out. And these things are all corroborated by midwives, by physicians, by doulas across the board. Next is this perception of being out of control. So like I said before, in a couple different instances, there is a requirement in the birthing process to surrender. Right? There comes a point where this is not a process that can be controlled by your mind. This is a process that involves a deep release, right? You have to release control of your body. And for somebody who has been struggling with the idea of being out of control, a person who has not been able to own their body and to own their choices, this is going to provide a significant problem for being able to facilitate release and facilitate the birthing process moving forward. Following that is also feeling hopeless to defend one's wishes to a care provider. So we know that physicians are pushy. We know that nurses are pushy. We know that in a lot of scenarios, this idea of kind of this medical hierarchy of who has the right, who has got the highest level of knowledge, who gets to assert their wishes in these particular scenarios. And we know that there is often a power imbalance between providers and our clients, our patients, ourselves in those scenarios. And if you have felt hopeless to be able to defend your yes or to defend your no, that's going to be targeted in some of these scenarios, right? The next point here, the next box, is about disassociation versus labor land. I talked a little bit about this kind of like somatic detachment. So in this process of release during the childbearing, the child labor process, there is a release that's required, right? And a part of that release is where we see birthing people go into this kind of mystical, like ethereal place of surrender that is often required to release, and that is required to give birth, right? And that's also very different from disassociation, where this is more of a negative coping mechanism where people have to really leave their bodies, leave the environment and separate themselves because the process has become too physiologically, too mentally overwhelming for them to stay in. We have birthing people say they have to They envision themselves on the ceiling of the room. They envision themselves in the corner watching themselves because it is too uncomfortable to be in the body. And that's something that has to be watched for, where you might believe this is labor land. You might believe this is, oh, this person is now on cloud 9, preparing to labor for their child, as opposed to disassociation. All those things that will show up in the immediate acts of childbirth. And then lastly, we have words and phrases. So there are physical cues, of course, that may be reminders to sexual trauma, but there could also be verbal cues. So there are lists and lists of words and phrases that could trigger a birthing person, right? Something that might be meant as an affirmation, something that might be meant to encourage the birthing person, could be language that an abuser had previously used on them, right? So there's a whole set of those words and phrases. I won't go into them right now just for its potential effect on triggering, but it is important to know that there are words that can trigger flashbacks. And if folks are unaware or they're having a new evolution of memory during that birthing process, we have to be very, very sensitive to what we might believe colloquially are words of affirmation or words of encouragement, because those things might mean something very different to a person who is experiencing the ramifications of sexual trauma during childbirth. I feel like I'm talking 1,000 miles a minute. So if y'all still in here, I hope you are. So in terms of how do we do that? If we're supporting a person, how do we know what's happening? And these are some of those physical cues and indicators during labor and birth that we can look for. A sense of high anxiety, panic attacks, confusion, perhaps recoiling at touch, having a racing heart, a dry mouth. Amina talked about some of these things before, and these are not just at labor and birth, but these are cues that we can get a sense that that someone's nervous system is out of whack right now, that they are not able to really fully be present. These are things that are taking them out of their grounding. You might see a need to be covered at all times, panic during vaginal exams, and as I mentioned before, disassociations from their surroundings and their experiences. All things that as support people, we can be further engaged in. As clinicians, as providers, we need to be clued into as well. Oh, this is a quote from Betty Martin that I like, because it talks about really how are we attending to sensations in our bodies. So while we're talking today about childhood sexual abuse and what sensations might appear, we also have to get closer to being able to attend to our sensations in general. We cannot move into the space directly of consent if we are not being present with our bodies. So in this, I'm not going to read the whole thing. What she talks about is often she thought that people perceived a problem with knowing how to relax, how to attend to their sensation, how to respect and accept their desires. They had trouble knowing how to be vulnerable, playful, generous, or how to set limits. They had trouble receiving, even knowing what it meant, trouble giving and knowing what that meant. These things are much more fundamental, but because difficulty with them seems so normal, people often didn't notice them until sex was involved. So they thought it was about sex, but far more often it was a challenge with these more basic skills. How are we in touch with sensation? So even before we're engaging with providers, how are we in touch with sensations of discomfort, of sensations that says, oh, that's too far, of sensations that says, hey, we could possibly relax here. We have an invitation to relax. Are we able to honestly give consent? Are we honestly able to sit with our sensations before we even offer consent in a lot of places? And I like what Betty Martin says here is that these are really our basic skills. And hopefully throughout Consent Con, you all are coming to a greater understanding of all the different ways that attending to sensation shows up for you before you can actually give consent. This is our little calming break in between. All right, so now thinking about what is our healthcare system, we talked about what it looks like in terms of maternal health care, but what should our healthcare system be doing? Now, I say this with the idea that I think that birthing people, people who are accessing sexual and reproductive health care should be able to access it anywhere. But the reality is many people are going to be going into our mainstream healthcare services. And there's been a push, or I'd say over the last 10 years or so, to make more of our care trauma informed. Now, for a medical system, for our medical industrial complex to function in the way that it is, you'd have to imagine that there are going to be limitations with how well these systems, and even systems operating outside of that, are able to fully integrate these principles. These are the 6 principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So I started a couple of these because I think that some of these are particularly, they're all important, but some of them have even more, a bit more enhanced importance for people who are survivors of sexual harm and sexual abuse. Safety, thinking about what are the components of safety in the environment? What are the pieces that people want to see when they are beginning to embark upon care in a particular care environment? Making sure that those principles have begun to be integrated, right? That there's a climate of safety inside of where you're seeking healthcare services. That there's trustworthiness and transparency between provider and client, that there's trustworthiness and transparency between support persons and providers, that there is access to peer support, whether or not that be from doulas or support partners, loved ones that come in and share space with you, making sure that that's possible. That there's a climate of collaboration and mutuality. This is super important. And we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at healthcare facilities, which I'll talk about in a second, where this is showing up. Are there opportunities for mutuality, opportunities for mutual learning between yourself and the clinicians, and between yourself and providers? Is that climate say that this is possible? And if not, this is likely not a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive place to be seeking care. How is empowerment, voice, and choice showing up? Where are the places where you have choice? Where are the places where your voice can be heard, where it can be brought to the table? These are all the places that are going to impact the quality of care that you receive. And then the last principle there just kind of reinforces how are cultural, historical, and gender issues, how is awareness of how your community has been treated, how your community, what your community's strengths are, how are these pieces showing up as a part of trauma-informed care? Overall, we need all of our care to be trauma-informed, and that goes beyond our acknowledging of trauma. It has to really get into understanding how the trauma occurs, what happened, too fast, too soon, too often, without any remediation. It also means that our healthcare system has to actively resist re-traumatization. And in order to do that, they have to be aware of how trauma occurs and aware of all the different ways that trauma can be reinforced and that re-traumatization can happen inside of our healthcare settings. And then lastly, our healthcare system inside its formal networks or outside of that has to support healing, has an obligation to support healing for individuals who come through the threshold. All right, so now let's get into the tools. I have talked to y'all, I've talked your ears off about what all the terrible pieces of our healthcare system. Now let's talk about how are we going to better navigate consent for survivors. So I took this slide, or at least I took some of the content from this. Amina gave a session this morning where she talked about 3 ways to really be able to navigate consent. And I've kind of tweaked that to 3+1 ways to navigate consent for survivors. So knowing what we know about our healthcare system and the way that it's currently structured, there's a critical element of preparation. Now, someone said, I think Amina said earlier in reference to Resma's book, like identifying the exits. As a survivor, there's often this idea that we have to come in, scan a space, identify the exit, figure out exactly how we can get out of this room. We got 4 different ways to escape this place. We know which window we can go out of, which door we can go out of. And I like to liken that to what choices do we have? What do we know about our choices? What exits can we pursue when we're seeking care? right? So a part of that is going to come into preparation. How do we prepare for that? The next is consent confidence. How do we build our confidence to be able to authentically give consent? What does the practice of that look like? Third is making sure that we have space for self-regulation so that we can find, ground, and center ourselves to be able to offer authentic consent. And then lastly, having a supportive community that supports us along our journeys to be able to fully engage in authentic consent. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So this is also a riff from Amina. I was in the consent con this week and I had all my slides together and I was like, oh, Amina said something great. Let me tie that into what I was saying, because she's saying it so much more succinctly. So when we think about how we frame our consent practice, like a lot of our inability to say yes or our inability to say no is from a fear-based place, right? So we think, okay, there's a fear here, that fear of being told no, that fear of confronting another inability to be able to advocate for ourselves. And what does that mean? What's really preventing us from being able to say no? A lot of this is rooted in shame about our previous experiences, shame that we may be bringing from our past, from our previous scenarios into this current one, right? Saying, okay, well, now I know really I don't have the ability to advocate for myself. And now that means I'm not really worthy of having access to the services that I want to have access to. I'm not worthy of having my no heard. So dealing with issues of worthiness is really going to be important as a foundation, being able to establish an effective consent practice for survivors. So Amina said in her talk earlier, like, how do we tend to this so that we can build ourselves up to be able to consent more? How do we build our consent confidence? How do we get used to saying no, right? Hearing our own no, and also hearing no back to us, right? Oh, well, actually, we can't modify that procedure. We have to do this. But all of this comes as a part of a practice. But knowing that the framing around our consent practices a lot of times comes from fear and shame and worthiness, right? So how do we prepare for that? How do we prepare for some of these conversations? And I think one way to do that is really, as I started to allude to earlier, thinking about what are the environments that we're going into? Well, we know we're going into this medical industrial complex. We know that in a lot of ways, providers have been given kind of carte blanche over our bodies. And so knowing that there are certain places and environments where that's going to be more prevalent than others is really important. Choosing a provider that takes into account your thoughts, takes into account your voice, your choice, listens to you, right, as you are making complaints or you are asserting yourself, and find space and common ground there, right? Not a provider who is going to shut you down. And I don't mean in any way to put this as a responsibility on the birthing person. These environments should be shaped in this way. But I think a little investigation as to who the provider is that you're choosing, what facility you're choosing to go into, whether or not that is a traditional hospital system, whether or not that's a birthing center, whether or not that's with a midwife or having a doula as an advocate. All of these are ways that we can prepare ourselves for what could likely be very intense scenarios. And we at least want to know that we've got a few things checked off on our box. Another part of that preparation might mean asking your provider, asking the clinician, asking the nurses, how do they respond to refusals for medical interventions? Oftentimes, these medical settings will create kind of a false sense of urgency around certain procedures, right? Asking providers, asking them in these conversations when we're interviewing them, like, how do you respond to that? How do you respond ethically to that? And in a lot of ways, that tells us what will happen when we are in these high pressure scenarios. So making sure that we're prepared for that. Another part of preparation is making sure that we've got established rapport with our doulas if we decide, to bring a doula into the process. Knowing how a doula is prepared to advocate for us, what kind of silent cues we may be able to give to the doula, what the doula is willing to do for us in terms of allowing space for a pause that might be needed that we may not necessarily have the words for at that time. All super important parts of rapport building. There's also kind of preparation around your other support persons. Let's say you don't have a doula and you have, let's say your partner is with you, let's say your mother, your father, someone who is there supporting you, making sure that you're on the same page and that you've got a process established for if your support person needs to get clarity, that doesn't instantly feel like a sabotage to you, right? And that you've got some way of checking in with your support person and knowing, kind of having these rehearsed conversations in advance. And I liken these to identifying where the exits are, knowing where you can leave, where you might want to stay a little bit longer, where you might want to get more information, and how you can exit the process if it is not working for you. So, like I mentioned, this concept of worthiness shows up because I think sometimes in these scenarios, we don't necessarily know what we deserve, what we are deserving of in these places. Reproductive justice, which is a principle that I frame a lot of my work around, asserts that we have the right to give birth, to not give birth, to parent and raise our children in safe and sustainable environments, and to really give birth in our terms, right? So as a part of thinking about that, because the healthcare system has been so repressive for so long, it is sometimes difficult to imagine what are all the beautiful things that are possible to us. The National Association for Black Birth releases the Birthing Bill of Rights, the Black Birthing Bill of Rights. I think this is the second release that they've done over the last couple of years that really helps to provide language for birthing people, for people who are coming into these medical scenarios, to know how to navigate, to know what they can ask for, to know what they are deserving of. And it also serves as a guide for support persons, for physicians, for clinicians, to know what are the basic ethical standards that they need to be operating with when they are providing care. So one of the first ones is I get to choose my healthcare. I get to decide if I want to continue on with this provider, if I want to change providers, if I'd like to stay in this practice, that I have that choice. Oftentimes we'll have people who get into scenarios where they might believe they can't leave their provider, that they got to stay with their provider for the entire duration of their treatment, and that's not the case. They have the right to change providers or birthing facilities. They also have the right to have an advocate, to have a perinatal advocate to help to address those concerns. This might be a loved one, this might be a support person, this might be a doula. You have the right to have those with you at all times. This also extends to an infant or a newborn. You have the right to determine what's right for your baby. You have the right to have your providers respect your culture and your traditions. And I know a lot of this seems like really elementary, but in a place where rights are often overlooked and overshadowed, it is helpful to have a reminder. You have a right to be informed. You have the right to be informed of all of your choices, right? Whether or not a provider thinks that's a good choice for you or not, you have a right to be informed to that. If you have a right to be heard or right to be listened to, right? So if you think about this idea of shame and inability to really understand what you're deserving of, having something like the Birthing Bill of Rights really helps to frame like all the possibilities for you. And this is just an excerpt. There are probably like 40 of them that really speaks to what people can feel confident in advocating for themselves for in these birthing spaces. And these are just kind of the precursors to consent. These are the things that you deserve to have, right? Even before you make a choice about what it is that you want in the process. Oh, my favorite one. I have the right to say no. I have the right to refuse medical interventions. I have the right to have my body honored. I have the right to show up fully as myself in these processes. And we know that the healthcare system is often linked to other policing systems and that it can feel difficult to say no. But again, like I mentioned before, understanding your provider's perspective on refusals of consent and how that might play into the policing system is also super, super important to do upfront and in advance. You have the right to say no. You have the right to revoke consent, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So that's the first thing, making sure that we've got the preparation. And the preparation involves understanding, knowing where your provider stands, understanding the climate that you're interacting in, and understanding what's available and accessible to you. The second part, and Amina talked on this this morning, building your own self-regulation strategies. So like I mentioned, these kind of like physiological responses, dry mouth, racing heart, needing to be covered at all times, recoiling from touch. These are spaces that CSA survivors might find themselves in, and your ability to give consent is going to be greatly compromised. So having a space to feel, having a space to separate, and to be regulated, to be grounded, to be recentered is very, very important. Now, you may have your own method for self-regulation. I personally like EFT tapping as a way to bring myself back to my center, as a way to give myself affirmations. I am safe, I am nurtured, I am heard. Whether it's noticing sensations in your body, whether it's a body scan, a short meditation, a breathing exercise, tapping, having your own self-regulation strategy is going to be critical to getting to the place where you can actually even listen for consent. And I put these invitations of centering here, and Amina will have some resources as well in the guide at the conclusion of the consent con. But I think even before you're selecting what that self-regulation strategy is, you have to have the space for it. So understanding with your support persons that you might need a bit of protective space to be able to even engage in the strategy. You'd imagine it might be difficult to do a body scan when you've got 15 or 20 people coming in and out of a room, 15 or 20 people asking you questions. Having the space to get centered, having the space to get grounded is going to be critical. And that's the first step. So we've got framing, understanding what we need, what we deserve, understanding how we're going to battle this idea of worthiness by really knowing what's available to us and having a protected space for self-regulation. Now let's move into consent. All right, so now we know what we can anticipate, we know what to expect, we know what we can demand in these spaces. We've got some space to calm ourselves, to re-regulate ourselves, to get grounded so that we can begin to hear. And now we move into consenting. And I think perhaps not in this group, but maybe in other scenarios, we think of consent as just saying yes. Okay, I read it. I read the permission. I read the sheet, and now yes, I say yes to that. But there's so much more room for that. There is yes, there is no, and there's something else. So after we've taken what they refer to as kind of that sacred pause to listen to what the request is, to listen to what the invitation is for us at that time in these intense scenarios, we take that sacred pause. We take that time to breathe, to scan our bodies, to notice the sensations that are coming up for us. And if we have a full and embodied response, yes, I feel as though I can say yes to this without going against myself, then your answer may be yes. And that might be a little easier. Or if you don't feel that immediately, you need to sit for a little longer, your response might be no. Or it might be, I need more information, or I need more time to consider what's being asked of me. And this all comes from Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent in the allowing quadrant, where she talks about yes, no, need more time to really properly assess how this request is showing up for you. And of course, you can use that for everything. I'm just talking specifically about in this medical context. So if it's not an embodied yes, if you don't feel as though you can fully offer this thing or receive this thing with a full heart, then you're likely in the no or need more information or more time. The no can be very direct. The no can also come after you've taken a little bit of time to sit with the request, right? Or you've asked some additional follow-up questions that will help you to gather more information, to notice within your body whether or not that is a yes or a no. Lastly, on this slide, there's this idea also of revoking consent. Sometimes there may be some, let's say we've answered yes too quickly. Let's say we didn't wait and listen for an answer within. Now there's this sense of, okay, I really would like to change my mind, but I feel some shame about that. I feel as though I might not be able to access that. Remembering that Bill of Rights, remembering what we are entitled to, remembering what is to be provided for us in this birthing Bill of Rights helps us to remember that we can also now revoke consent. Let's say, for example, your provider wanted you to get in a particular position for labor or for an exam. You're in this position now that you've consented to without a full embodied consent. And now you're starting to feel, you're noticing sensations come up in your body. You can, of course, at that point, begin to revoke consent. This is no longer working for me. I need to change. I need a moment. Taking the time and space to step away from that scenario may make that situation feel less confrontational, right? And more so that you can get away and get to your safe space so that you can, again, now listen, notice those sensations, and be able to revoke consent at that moment. And having supportive persons around you, having your support people around you can also help you to move from just yes, no, need more information to being able to stand up and to revoke consent. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our supportive community. And I've talked a little bit about this, kind of weave this throughout the process. I don't suggest that people navigate these types of healthcare spaces without a doula or a support person present. The pressure and the power imbalances can often feel overwhelming. And I think having support, having people who have an understanding of our histories and who we have built rapport with and who we can continue to communicate with during these intense scenarios is incredibly important for being able to practice authentic consent throughout this process from start to finish. So in terms of doulas, we know that doulas can help support us in terms of the preparation. So whether or not that means they are sitting with us as we are asking questions of providers in those kind of initial intake interviews, asking questions about how they respond to medical refusals, asking about their history and the way that they support people with particular types of sexual trauma. Having a support person by your side can help you to feel more secure, more safe in asking those types of questions. They can also help you to kind of scan and assess whether or not this is a place where you want to be, a place where you want to be accessing and receiving services. Doulas and partners can also offer support by kind of creating a buffer and a barrier for that sacred pause. Doula friends and colleagues who will say that, if they notice in their observation of their clients that their client is feeling or demonstrating some anxiety, some degree of fidgeting, they might notice kind of a quickened breath or quickened heart rate, some of those physiological displays. They can offer a buffer for that sacred pause that you might need, right? Where a provider is they're just hitting you with questions after questions after questions. And you might need that buffer to be able to step back and say, okay, what is it that I'm doing? What are they asking? They can also help to ask for additional clarity in talking with those providers. So having them to help support you in preparation, knowing what to expect, and also being a buffer so that you can have space to come back to yourself, that you can be centered so that you can proceed at the time and at the pace that's necessary for you and your healing. There's a kind of sub comment here about discussions with partners. So I mentioned before, like knowing that you and your partner are on the same page at all times, right? Saying, hey, these are the ways in which I want you to support me. This is how I want you to look at me for these particular cues. If you need to have a conversation with the provider where you need to step out of the room, or it appears that you're now leaning towards the provider side, you and I need to have a conversation in advance of that. Because what you don't want to have happen is now your partner, your support person now appears to be trading sides on you, right? That's something that's definitely going to interrupt the safety and the trust balance that may have been established going into this. So making sure that there is space to have discussions ahead of time before there are discussions specifically with providers, with your partners and your doula supports is going to be super, super, super important. Observation I mentioned before. being in tune, having that rapport established with your doula, having that rapport established with your partner, that you may be in spaces where you're unable to speak, right? And that there's some degree of observation where they can check in with you. How are you feeling about this? Do you need more time? Would you like people to leave the room? Would you like it quiet in here? Would you like the lights down? Would you like X, Y, and Z? And giving an opportunity for that person to say, to continue to practice consent throughout the process. No, I don't want any more questions. Yes, I would like people to leave. And having that kind of constant observation so that that person is also standing in the gap for you when you were unable to speak. And then lastly, like I mentioned before on the previous slide, knowing that there's a possibility of revoking consent is going to be incredibly important as you're moving through the consent process. What might have started off as a sacred pause and you taking that yes, no, need more information may now show up later as this is not working, and making sure that your partners and your doulas are supporting you in being able to do that is going to require that advanced preparation and continuous and ongoing discussion with your partners. So just to, okay, I think we're getting close on time, just to kind of summarize what we need to be able to consent as survivors in these particular medical settings where sexual trauma can be re-inflamed is we need to know what we're worthy and deserving of. Having that birthing bill of rights, having something like a reproductive justice framework, knowing that you have the right to give birth to a child in the way that you determine appropriate and accessible for you is super important. Knowing that you are worthy of all of these pieces, right? Kind of takes this and compartmentalizing it a little bit. However, it can be extracted to the broader world, knowing what you're worthy and deserving of. And in this instance, it shows up as birthing bill of rights. Feeling prepared, knowing where the windows are, where are the exit strategies, knowing you can change providers, knowing you can change positions, knowing that you can revoke consent. All of these things, this preparation is going to be super important to be able to identify the spaces in which you can maneuver and you feel comfort in maneuvering and getting in and out of these scenarios. Also going to need to have space to pause, space for that sacred pause, space to be able to hear your own voice, and space to self-regulate. Having a supportive person, having a doula, a partner there to help protect that space is going to be critically important. We also need to practice building our consent confidence. And this comes, I didn't say this earlier, but this comes in practicing our consent in little different ways. And that might be with the medical clerk, that might be with the front desk agent, that might be with the nurse, that might be with the provider, having all the different ways that you are listening for your voice and not leaving consent for the big choices, not leaving consent for whether or not they're saying, do you want a C-section or not? Do you want them to rupture your membranes or not? But making small, dedicated efforts to embody consent throughout the entire process, listening. I think one of the ways that we betray ourselves is by assuming that it's only the big choices that matter, when all of our choices are mattering all throughout, all of the different ways that we may be silencing ourselves and following in a pattern that stem from abuse or that stem from shame and stem from that previous harm. We have opportunities to correct them, and building that consent confidence, that consent muscle is something that's going to require consistent practice in every interaction. Yes, no, need more time or information, as well as revoking consent. And then lastly, making sure that we can do all of these things through the support of others, and that there are people who will be by our sides, our loved ones, our doulas, our support persons, even our clinicians, if we've had an opportunity to build rapport and to establish certain groundings with them around how we intend to be treated, what particular histories may come into the birthing process. All of these will be really critically important to making sure that we're able to give full and embodied consent when we are in these practices, from the time we enter the door to the time we are leaving, from the time that we are home, recovering during postpartum, we have questions, we have things that we need answers. All of these are going to require knowing what we deserve, practicing asking for it, practicing refusing things that don't work for us, and looking to our community for support throughout these processes. I know that was a lot. It's a ton of information. This presentation is usually about 2 hours long. So I hope that it wasn't too overwhelming, consolidating the information all here. But I think the key takeaway points are here on the slide. Knowing what you're worthy and deserving of. Do you feel prepared? Do you have information in advance? Are you self-regulating? Do you have space to do that? Are you practicing and all of your minor interactions, opportunities for consent? And do you have the support of those loved ones around you? Yeah, so that's it. I will stop sharing now. And if there are questions, feedback, happy and open to hearing that. Hey, Mackenzie, I don't know, are you supposed to do something now?
Oh my gosh, just tell you that was really, really amazing. And thank you for that and giving us such a great framework for accessing our rights in a way that we're not traditionally taught is available to us. That was really impactful. I think it was great information, but it was also really great practical application. I'm ready to go assert my medical rights right now. I'm going to set up an appointment just so I can go and consent and not consent and unconsent and re-narrate my consent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's I think what's important about this is that, like, so this is the area that I work in. So I primarily working in maternal health, sexual and reproductive health, whether or not that's abortion access, whether or not that's birth control, whether or not that is fertility treatments. There's so many different ways in which this framework shows up. But I think the beauty of the consent practice is like, we have so many opportunities throughout the day, so many opportunities to practice consent. And that if we are aware that this consent confidence or this consent muscle is something that we need to build, it's a responsibility of ours to make sure that we're taking on all of those tiny interactions so that we can build that, so that we don't get into these scenarios where, you know, now the pressure is so intense and that we are feeling that we haven't practiced enough and that we haven't strengthened ourselves enough. And I think for survivors of sexual harm, it's even more important to practice doing that, for the fear of the collapse and the fear of regression back into states that we may have operated in as children and have come into as adults. So I hope it was helpful, and thank you all for listening and coming in. And I hope that some of the points that I made brought us back to previous conversations, either from Amina's session today or sessions from yesterday, really thinking about how we build this muscle and how do we listen to our bodies? How do we get centered enough so that we can hear and not rush from our own programming, whatever that is. If it's people pleasing, if it's fear of rejection, if it's this kind of like self-sabotage, whatever it is, that we're at a space where we can hear ourselves, that we can hear our heartbeats, that we can feel centered and grounded enough to be able to make a yes, no, need more information, or I said yes, but actually it's no. And I think it's a beautiful process that's helpful for all of us. And I hope that everyone can take something from it for themselves or for those that you're supporting in your lives. So thanks everybody for hanging out.
Yes, thank you, Inez. Almost Dr. Madi. We really appreciate you taking your time to hang out with us and give us all that you got. I want to thank everyone else again for showing up. And you can check the schedule to see what else is happening for the rest of the day and the rest of the weekend. Any resources mentioned here will, of course, be in the resource guide. I hope you guys have a fabulous evening and happy Friday, everyone. Bye.